proposition about a framework for concepts of research supervision came out of interviews that I did initially, as was indicated, at Surrey, but then with other universities across the UK, and then I got introduced to some people at Harvard. So you'll see an American flavour in some of the quotes that come through. It was a qualitative study, which is not something that's particularly well funded these days, I have to say, but luckily Surrey have supported me in doing it. And so I interviewed this increasing network of supervisors who were referred to me as being good or even excellent. When Harvard got involved, of course, I started using words like inspirational and things like this, upping the ante. But there is another study to be done on what is, how do you identify good supervisors in a way for a study like this. And the process was very pragmatic. I asked students and I asked academic colleagues to refer people to me and to recommend people. And the first thing that came through was this functional theme, came through their interviews, where supervisors were taking people in rational progression through tasks. And I want to let some of the supervisors speak for themselves, so I've got a few quotes from them. And the first one is this business of there is a plan, 3 months, 6 months and 12 months. In the second year we see them monthly and they produce 5,000 words before each meeting. Well, that's quite an order. We have a regular pair or small group meetings, or I have a weekly timetable formal slot for them. We have agendas for supervision meetings planned for a year ahead. Now you might ask, well, are these all science PhDs? No, they're not. Some are. And Surrey is a science, predominantly science and engineering university, but we do have, and I did include, people from arts and humanities and social sciences. And this is the interesting thing that I'm finding, is that some of these movements are actually generic to all disciplines. At every meeting we used to write up notes. We both would sign them and I would give them a copy, so we had a common understanding of what we talked about. Functional, very important for the audit trail. And this was from a humanities supervisor who found that the student was writing reams but not actually focusing. So the functional approach to that was actually to limit the number of words and saying, I won't read anything else apart from these 2,000 words that I set you. It's a very directive approach, the functional approach. Here's another, we insisted they kept logbooks. Again, it sounds sciencey, but social sciences do this too, from which time to time we would sign off on. Most of the formalities were only needed in the first year to 18 months, because after that they'd adopted this practice. This was a supervisor who supervised on both sides of the Atlantic and probably had I think about 120 successful PhDs under his belt. This was interesting because I'm talking about this generic movement in the pedagogy of supervision. And here we have a humanities supervisor saying, or in fact social sciences, I think they found me being so directive very difficult. They thought that they could swan in and wander around the literature for a bit. I've said they've got to be here 9 till 5. A very interesting, different approach for some of us in terms of supervising in that field. And I put the soft applied. I haven't bothered putting the disciplines under many of them because the quotes can apply generically. But here I put soft applied because I thought it was unusual. And I'm using the categorization that was given by Biglan and used by Tony Beecher into pure and soft subjects and hard and applied. So the next heading was enculturation, people becoming members of the discipline. And here the supervisor isn't necessarily the fount of all knowledge, but is the gatekeeper, a phrase borrowed from general practitioners, really. And they have an idea of what they want the successful PhD student to look like, so their role is one of diagnosis of the gaps, of the deficiencies, and coaching the person until they reach this stage of being. And some of these quotes which exemplify this, I feel I have failed if they didn't stay in the field, and we'll see this one played through later on as well. One I particularly like, my students all know their academic grandfather. If that's not enculturating, what is? I have introduced all my students to my supervisor. Students need to know what good enough looks like. And interesting, just bear this in mind when we're talking about the demand for original research. And then the bottom three, I'm not going to explore further, but there is a whole issue about enculturation of international students. So I'm just saying that this exists, and we need to think about it, but I'm not going to explore it further this morning. One approach to enculturation here is get them in the lab, get their hands dirty, and then get them onto the literature. Another one is a very interesting one about enculturation, about making the implicit explicit. There was a postdoc who broke rules that I'd never explicitly formulated about a collaborative rather than a competitive atmosphere. This supervisor wanted an atmosphere where results were shared, and this student went off and published on their own. And he describes how that upset many people in the group. And went on to think about how in future that implicit expectation was going to be made explicit amongst the group. And in fact, said was very cynical, managed to get a sum of money to do a team building workshop for PhD students as they started, and said, I really didn't think it was going to be any good, it's not my bag to do that sort of thing, but they seemed to want to do it and I had the money. And was amazed at how much this short residential team building program did build up the cohort and that collaborative atmosphere that was sought. And then taking these quotes and taking that theme in supervisor development workshops, then together we work with people saying, well, if that's what we want to do, if enculturation is part of what we want to do in bringing doctoral students together and working, encouraging them to become academics, these are some of the things that we can do to encourage that to happen. And in workshops and seminars, we will be looking at how we might apply those in practice, where we can borrow activities from one discipline and apply them in another. This business of encouraging the student to read biographies of significant academics can be really interesting in every discipline, actually. In Gießen, in Germany, they encourage their doctoral students to run a whole undergraduate module themselves. And so they empower them to both invite guest speakers, organise colloquia, and run a whole undergraduate module, which gets enormously good feedback. Creating together the list of essential works to be mastered, that elusive thing, the canon, which turns out, of course, to be an individual exercise, but it's a jolly good discussion for a bit. Arranging, I mean, things that I'm sure we all do, but just getting this list together is quite interesting when you're pulling together a doctoral training program and saying how many of these are we consciously going to set ourselves to do, what's relevant in this context. And it is relevant because we are all the time being encouraged to create this critical mass. So what are we going to do with this critical mass? How are we going to make it something really good? And then the third element that came through from the interviews was critical thinking. And I guess that's what a lot of us think that doctoral education is really all about. It's really all about the skills of critical thinking and evaluation and challenge. And when I spoke to these excellent supervisors about this area, or it came through in their interviews because I didn't lead them to it, they led me to it, you could see their thinking changed, and they were actually, it was almost as if they were visualizing the brains of the student and completely depersonalizing them. So this is a different aspect of doctoral education, completely. And they said to me things like, they need to explain to me why, what, and how. I asked them to email me a question about their project every week, and this supervisor went on to say, and I tell them that if they don't, I will forget them. I rather liked the idea of magic words to help them to identify the thread in their argument. I spent some time looking for magic words, but I thought they were rather nice and probably particularly helpful for students working in a second language. And then this idea began to come through, which we will see again in a moment, of, yes, critical thinking, but actually encouraging independence in critical thinking. So it's about encouraging a metacognition, an ability to critique their own ideas. And so supervisors also were speaking to me about what they thought a good thesis was, and that of course led to some thoughts on critical thinking. I thought this was quite interesting. I expect them to learn, how to reason, and how to start into something new, because this is really beginning to look at a doctoral education as something to do with transferable skills. I really want them to have an independence and an ability to step into the unknown and make a contribution to knowledge and society. And I thought that was very helpful. And the similar thread came through this one. You learn on a PhD to think of a new experiment, to design a new experiment and carry it through, and to defend your result by publication and through talks with your colleagues. And these are skills that you can use in many disciplines, in many different environments. And how true that is. And in Germany, of course, as we know, and Jacqueline and I were at the same conference, I think, when we both first heard this, we know that in Germany you probably don't get a senior management job unless you've got a PhD. So it's regarded as the ultimate transferable skill there. So again, we would then go back to say, what are these core critical thinking skills? And this is one way of looking at them. And if you want to look at them, and I think all of this will be on the web later, the work by Donald, a Canadian, is very good at looking at critical thinking skills in the different disciplines. And I've done some analysis of that and tried again to say, well, what's generic, what actually unites all the different disciplines as well. And these are some of the themes that come through. And so one can look at that and say, okay, this is part of our agenda, doctoral student. How are we going to help you to reach high levels in each of these? And then the fourth of 5 possible themes, approaches to research supervision was emancipation. And this is very different to enculturation, very different to the functional framework. A supervisor who's working through an emancipatory framework will not be bound by a direction which says that they have to complete in 3 or 4 years. For them, the journey is important. The ultimate supervisor who's working through this framework, and only this framework, and nobody does just work through one of them, but if they were, this supervisor would say, I'll take on anybody who wants to do a PhD, because for me, the process of them working through it is the important thing. It's a radical humanistic perspective, probably, and the journey is as important as the completion. A debatable point, I know, but that would be the ultimate, I suppose, of the emancipatory framework. But really, it's focusing on mentoring and supporting, and it's not focusing on saying you've got to become a member of this discipline, and you have to act like everybody else in this discipline. And of course, this is the rub, when I mentioned earlier about original knowledge. I mean, we want people to be good in our discipline, but we also want them to be original. So when they were talking about emancipatory approaches to supervision, they were talking about getting them to know more than we do, getting students to take the initiative, again an independence thing, reading widely, not sticking with things that just relate purely to the discipline, getting them to admit and confront their own problems. And there's a lot of thinking needs to go on in some cases about why people have chosen particular topics to research. And the satisfaction for the supervisor is in facilitating the growth. And I think we probably can all share some of that. There's an emancipatory streak in all of us, I think. And this shows the rub for someone who hadn't got the emancipatory streak at the beginning, because it's quite interesting to look at how people change as supervisors over time. And this supervisor was saying, and I thought that this student would be the perfect faculty member. So when he announced to me he was going to go into management consulting, oh, the pits. I was totally flabbergasted. I was shocked. And I worked a little bit on him, and I bet he did. I tried to say, you should really go into academia. You should go into academia. And then I realised he had his mindset. So now I've given in. I've learnt to respect people's career choices. And I've realized that not everybody can become a physicist. And it's good to have people who are physicists in other careers. It speaks well for the discipline. So I've totally changed my opinion now. And it is quite interesting to see people changing their opinion on each of these approaches over time. And this comes back to this point that I made a little earlier. I want to know what their connection is with the research, why they want to do this. It's more of a problem in some disciplines than others. It's particularly often a problem in sociology and psychology. Well, I say often, it's small, but it's probably more apparent there than other places, where you have students who might want to research eating disorders, or rape, or family matters, and they're acting out their own concerns. So the question then comes up about boundaries, and what's the appropriate boundary, and what is the PhD for, and why are we developing the research skills, and what's transferable, and what's just going to be too close to home to be a useful project. And I've written, it's not published yet, although I hope it will be, I've written more about this and how supervisors have handled some of these very tricky situations. Emancipation, going back to my opening slide of the Rialto in Venice, I act as a bridge between the knowledge and the student, and eventually they don't need me, eventually they fly across the Grand Canal. And I like this one. I'm always waiting for that epiphany moment when the student feels confident enough to say, I don't agree. I really like that one. At the start, you know a little bit more than them. Probably not much, but your job is to get them knowing more than you. I want them to have changed how they see the world. I want the whole process. And certainly for most PhD students, it is a transforming process, and it does change how they see the world. Very few of my students, this was a supervisor who was doing a lot of, working with a lot of older PhD students, are doing it for an academic career. They want the intellectual rewards, so they were doing PhDs whilst they were working, part-time working students. And then this final one that came through, which was much more problematic. The other four I could see all having a kind of a professional attitude behind them and a set of skills behind them. But, of course, we know that when you work with a PhD student intensely over a period of time, a relationship develops. And what is happening when that happens? And I think we were in the land then, from the quotes that they gave me, of emotional intelligence. And the sorts of things that they were talking about was the need to enthuse, the need to give more of yourself than was strictly demanded, the need to encourage and inspire, to recognise achievement, and to give pastoral support. And this pastoral support was, I have also interviewed quite a lot of doctoral students, and this quote stayed with me too, and I know that it's representative of many. The pastoral support of my supervisors was really important, more important than anything else they did. And this was not, this was an English student speaking of English supervisors, so it wasn't, we didn't have that cultural, cross-cultural issue, which does require a lot of pastoral support as well. This was interesting. This is an opening gambit from an experienced supervisor. I always say to them, you'll go through a love-hate relationship with me. It'll probably be hate. I always think managing expectations at the beginning is good, isn't it? But if we can come out at the end talking to each other, possibly even as friends and colleagues in the future, that for me is a good outcome. I think that's a very interesting quote at the beginning, and very helpful for some people in terms of setting the ground. So what are we talking about here? Well, I had in the end to go back to Aristotle to look at this friendship business. And there's a quote here, perfect friendships are based on goodness and are obviously the most valuable. So they move on from emancipation. They're one stage on from that. Here, friends care more about the other person than they care about themselves. Well, that's a lot to ask for a supervisor, isn't it? Moreover, it means liking the other person for what he or she is, not for any incidental quality that they might possess. Such friendships only occur after a long time. And there's a quote in Aristotle about a friendship can only occur after you've shared a bushel and a half of salt. meaning a lot of meals together. And finally, there are few truly good friendships, because there are few truly good people. So I'm not saying this is the ultimate that we aim for at all. I'm just saying it is a thread of doctoral supervision in some circumstances. And there are boundaries that need to be observed in all of these fields, but particularly in this one. And Ives and Rowley observed that the power dynamic still exists and makes true friendship really difficult. In the end, you are involved with saying whether they can submit their thesis or not. And so there is a limit to how far friendship can go when that power dynamic comes in. And then there's also issues about, and a lot of supervisors tussle with this from time to time, how much responsibility do I have for this PhD student? In some cases where students have moved countries or continents and maybe brought their family with them, it can be really difficult